Welcome back to day two. Delighted to have you back. We really enjoyed yesterday. Some fantastic talks and discussions, some really great workshops, some real great energy in the room. So delighted to have you back today. So this morning, we didn't really plan it this way, but I realized that both of our keynotes are really the foremost thinkers on future cities, and both of them are people that we've had a long history with. Anthony Townsend, our keynote today, first crossed our paths at a time I mentioned yesterday, when we were first starting to think and play with mobile media, really taking digital art, digital media out into city spaces and finding ourselves sharing debates with architects, urban planners, and really thinking about the nature of the city, of the network city. Anthony back then was one of the key thinkers who was really forming the debate around cities, around locative media, as we called it back then. And Anthony has gone on to really be established as one of the foremost thinkers in this space. Anthony's research director at Insititute for the Future, and he's at New York University. And most exciting of all, Anthony's got a book that's going to be coming out soon, that's tipped to be a very, very significant contribution to the field. The usual way it works is that an author publishes a big book and then goes on a big book tour. But we applied every ounce of leverage we had to get him before the book launch, and we're really grateful for Anthony coming. The book is titled Smart Cities, Big Data, Civic Hackers, and the Quest for a New Utopia. That's going to be informing Anthony's talk, and just a note before I welcome him to the stage that Anthony's also pulled together a really significant debate this afternoon at 2 o'clock on the bespoke smart city. So we're getting our pound of flesh, and I'm genuinely delighted to welcome Anthony to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks, Drew. This is, kind of a long dream of mine to actually get here for FutureEverything. We had a couple abortive attempts over the last decade to get me here. The other thing that Dan Hill and I have in common is that we're both kind of deathly ill. So Dan lost his voice yesterday, and I was up half the night with a stomach bug. So those of you in the front row, unless you want to have like a Gallagher experience, in case I vomit on you, I would move back a little bit. But hopefully I'll be able to hold it together. So Dan actually covered a lot of the sort of foundational ground that I want to talk about in the beginning of this hour. I think everyone in this room is probably aware of this growing buzz around what people call smart cities. It goes by other names in industry marketing. IBM calls it smarter cities. Cisco calls it intelligent urbanization. You go back sort of 5 or 10 years and people talk about the information city or the wired city or the connected city, the digital city. Code for America, which is an NGO in the United States, calls it civic tech. I think it's all basically the same thing. It's this historic intersection of urbanization. We're entering a period of city building much greater than the world has ever seen. We'll go from 50% urban globally in 2008 to almost 90%, 80 or 90% by the time the century's over. And we'll build cities for as many people in the next 100 years as we have in all of human history in the last 6,000 years. And the other thing that's happening is that information technology is sort of taking this historic migration off the desktop and out of our homes and offices and into the streets and onto our bodies. And so a couple years ago, I started writing a book about this and trying to place it in a much broader historical narrative, both of urbanization and information technology. And I wasn't so much interested in the what of smart cities, the technology, as I was the who and the why. And I sort of think of this book almost as like a beginner's political economy of smart cities. It's sort of a stakeholder map and what's motivating all those stakeholders and what their aspirations and their goals are for these technologies. And the reason that I'm interested in that, because if you ask different people what smart cities are and what the promise is of information technology for cities, you get very, very different answers. So you ask someone like Carlo Ratti, who leads the Sensible City Lab at MIT, sort of a I say a leading practitioner in the instrumentation and visualization of big data about cities. And his perspective is smart cities are kind of awesome. This is inevitably good technology. It's akin to what's happened in Formula One racing, and Carlo uses this example all the time. In the last 20 years, Formula One race cars have become kitted out with all kinds of sensors that are streaming telemetry back to these pit crews that are surrounded, not by wrenches, but by digital screens that help them manage not just the driver's performance, but the vehicle's performance, various characteristics of the track that the car is running over, the weather and how climate's affecting combustion inside the engine. In that vision, the city is sort of a finely tuned machine. It's riddled with sensors that stream real-time data up into the cloud, where analytics bring intelligence to governments that have historically been paralyzed by politics or bureaucracy. And this isn't just sort of an academic or a designer's exercise. This has really become big business. And if you look at some of the marketing around smart cities, it's very telling. IBM basically portrays smart cities as just a killer app, an upgrade for cities that basically lets us have the cake of kind of excessive consumer consumption and eat it too, without having to really change our behavior. Buildings bring down their own energy costs. And these ads are in airports all over the world. They're in business magazines, leading financial newspapers. Drivers can see traffic jams before they happen. Now, if you're a mayor and you're passing through an airport and you see this, you're thinking to yourself, wow, I need to get some of this stuff because this is what people are going to expect. I have to deliver results. And you call up IBM and IBM can sell you a box that does this. And that's basically the promise. And in fact, this is what you're seeing in places like Rio de Janeiro, in the run-up to the Olympics. And this is a city that not so long ago, U.S. naval strategist Richard Norton called a feral city, a city that was on its way back to becoming a wild, ungoverned creature. Just a few weeks, I think, after they announced that they were getting the World Cup a few years ago. There was a widely, nationally televised, globally televised, YouTubed downing of a Rio police helicopter that got caught in between two rival drug gangs that were having a street battle. And they shot the police helicopter down on national TV. And this is just after they had said, we're going to host the world. So there's this real sort of crisis of wrestling control over the city. And so and then the Olympics are coming in 2016 as well. And so what the mayor, Eduardo Paez, did was he brought in IBM to build this command center. This has been, pretty widely covered. It's filled with people, there's computers, there's maps, there's live video feeds from 8,000 city buses, which is pretty fascinating. And it's all displayed on, there's a great infomercial that they produce which brags that this is Latin America's largest screen. As if that's, like a measure of good governance, is that you have the biggest screen in your control bunker. What's also interesting is that Paez sees this as kind of a gift to the favelas, that finally there's someone who's willing to do the things that are necessary to take care of them, which is a really interesting way of looking. I mean, Paez is he's sort of one of these progressive, managerial, globalizing mayors. He's not a fascist by any shot. But even, and Dan showed this yesterday, this is the Cisco Expo film showing a sort of, set of urban managers gathered around this 3D hologram of the city. They're almost like the gods on Mount Olympus, moving the characters around to make the world go the way that they want. And even in places where mayors don't have to run for election, like in China, you see this urge to basically build what are remote controls for the city. So now they're mostly just receiving sensor data and visualizing and allowing their decision support systems. They allow people to sort of have better information about what's happening in the city as they govern it and as they manage it. But increasingly, they'll be able to activate controls in the system and shunt traffic down a road if there's an emergency, or shut the power grid down in advance of a flood or whatnot. And what's really going on behind this is taking all of the same technologies that were applied to globalize industry and multinational corporations over the last couple decades, and applying that to government, and particularly to local government. And if you ask the people that are building these technologies, they'll tell you that's exactly what they're doing. Colin Harrison at IBM says this over and over again, that we instrumented the global supply chain over the last 20 years, but that didn't happen to government, and that needs to happen now. And there's a sort of hidden presumption behind that, is that government works just like a business. And I think that's really not valid. So there's other people that have a different perspective. I think we lost the picture. Did I do something wrong? Okay. There's other people that, I don't know why he keeps going away. He's a very handsome man. Okay. So anyways, that was Benjamin de la Peña, who is a program officer at the Rockefeller Foundation. And in 2010, he invited me into his office. And Benjamin was really excited about this technology too. He's kind of a geek at heart. He's also an urban planner, so he gets it. But he was really concerned about what all this new data about the city and new technologies that were being deployed would mean for the poor. And he had seen in India how the deployment of a land registry system in the Karnataka province, or Bangalore, which is sort of India's Silicon Valley, had digitized a land record system that had been in place for decades, if not longer, that operated primarily at the village level, and it was a paper-based system for figuring out who owned what. And sure, there was a lot of corruption in it, but the corruption was very decentralized, and the people who administered it were also available, in their village office to help peasants, illiterate peasants, through these complex land transaction processes. That was all centralized into a computer system, and what it ended up doing was it didn't empower the poor. It ended up empowering speculators, because it centralized all of the corruption at a provincial level. So, in order to bribe someone to get something done, you had to have a lot of money, because everything was sort of scaled up. And what it ended up doing, ironically, was empowering a bunch of expat investors in New Jersey, where there's a lot of wealthy Indian expats, to amass land ahead of the advancing front of growth of the Bangalore region, and to push people off their land. So a system that the World Bank funded, that was put in place to help the poor, actually ended up pushing them off their land. And we were sort of seeing this everywhere. And so he asked me, what does IBM's control panel mean for the favelas? Is it really going to empower them, or is it going to be used to oppress them? What if it falls into the hands of a revanchist government? Will it be used to suppress their enemies? What does Shanghai's control panel mean for all the millions of undocumented immigrants and laborers in the city? And he's a very persuasive guy, and so by the time I left his office, he had launched me on this project, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen. It was a forecast map called The Planet of Civic Laboratories that we published in December 2010. And this was kind of a 10-year look at what the opportunities were for the poor, for inclusion around smart cities, but also some of the risks and dilemmas. And it's kind of a celebration of the fact that we don't really know where this is going. There's a lot of different problems in all. Sasha Hasamayo, who's going to join us later this afternoon, has sort of guesstimated that there's about 550,000 local governments around the world. So every one of them is sort of a place where we can potentially develop new solutions for urban problems using these technologies. And I think really what this map was trying to do was question this base assumption that a lot of these big companies that were starting to play in smart city space was that you could cut and paste these solutions between cities without really having to tailor them or fit them to a local context. And that's actually what the panel that we're going to be talking about, I think at 2:30 this afternoon, is really going to dig into. Because it's the one big question from this research and from writing the book that I still don't know the answer to, or what the right direction is. And again, this idea that governments are inefficient, that they're siloed, that they're analog dinosaurs. I think Dan Hill raised a lot of these points yesterday, that there are some things about institutions that are really broken. But replacing them all with sort of market mechanisms or business management processes, the idea that you can streamline the public enterprise just like you did the private one, I think is bankrupt in a lot of situations. Because I think the most preposterous thing about a lot of those visions is that there aren't any citizens in them. And as you can see here from these citizens who are, sort of wheeling out on their wheelchairs to stop the destruction of their favorite tree. I don't even know where this is from. I just found it on the web, but I just think it's funny, that whatever it is these people are trying to stop, maybe a new road or a housing development, they're going to stop it. And that's the way cities work, is that people get together and they set their own agenda, independent of necessarily what's rational or what makes most sense financially. And then they get their voice heard. Citizens are not employees. They're not customers. They have to be dealt with on a different basis. So I think the idea that you could sort of just install a smart city like an upgrade, expect people to live with it, especially when it takes power away from them, as a lot of those command centers will, they're not going to accept it. And you have to engage them and grow it from the bottom up. And so that was sort of my hunch going into writing this book. And I think, we've seen this movie before in urban planning. If you go back to an earlier era of technological disruption, right after World War II, you had technocratic city builders like Robert Moses in New York. Robert Caro, his biographer, called him the power broker. He was probably America's most prolific builder. And one of his misguided projects was to try to plow a superhighway through Manhattan's Greenwich Village, which is called the Lower Manhattan Expressway. Moses really reshaped the city around the automobile, and it was kind of a corporate vision. GM's Futurama Pavilion from the 1939 World's Fair, which kind of envisioned American landscape based around the automobile with big sweeping highways, and if you go to Atlanta or Houston, that's basically built on that vision. And so I wonder if the mayors of Rio and Shanghai are kind of paving the way for the visions of Cisco and IBM. I don't know. The technologies are different, but I don't like the way that they're going about it. And I think leaving your citizens out of that visioning process is really setting yourself up for failure. Because we've seen that movie too. And that's what happened in New York when Moses proposed this highway. People like Jane Jacobs, who you may know more as a writer than a community organizer, but that's how she got started. And she, along with a bunch of other people, stopped the highways. They stopped the blighting of neighborhoods like the West Village. Interestingly, it was a battle fought with big data. On the one hand, by data assembled by Robert Moses' army of planners and architects, and then on the other hand, by a group of volunteers organized by Jacobs and her colleagues, who went out and crowdsourced a survey of the building stock in the West Village to prove that it wasn't overcrowded and it wasn't dilapidated. It's kind of like a really early example of crowdsourcing around big data. But sort of Jacobs taking on Moses and winning and blocking these highways didn't just stop those projects. It emasculated the whole profession of city planning. And it really hasn't regained the power that it had before then. And that actually wasn't a bad thing because it forced planners to reinvent themselves and stop trying to optimize the city with great physical designs, and instead to embrace citizens as stakeholders, as sources of new idea, and even actually as implementers of the plans themselves. And some say this is why we may no longer make big plans. But again, as Dan highlighted yesterday, this is an age in which very big things can come from massively coordinated human activity that doesn't necessarily get planned from the top down. And so the way I've come to think about this is, what if we stop thinking about building smart cities like a mainframe, which is kind of this industry vision, and think about it more like we built the web, as a sort of kind of loosely intercoupled networks. And the reason I think we need to do this is I don't think we have a chance. These two sides are coming to blows. These are different approaches to building smart cities, and they're playing out in this much bigger struggle over control between people and governments, as Dan said, that's playing out in the piazza and social media, literally being waged in the streets. The part that Dan didn't talk about are the technological countermeasures that are being wielded by governments. And it's really striking that the same strategy of basically lobotomizing a city by turning off its internet and turning off its mobile networks that was used in Egypt, in Cairo in particular, was deployed within 6 months in San Francisco to stop a riot in the transit system, They shut down the cellular network on the BART train stations. And it was widely talked about here in the United Kingdom after the rioting that there should be kill switches for social networks in case the government needs them. So in the middle of this battleground, you've got our humble city leaders, mayors, council people, their staffs, and they really are in the position where they sort of have to avoid this conflict because the business of government, the business of the city, the economy needs to go on. And I think you really have to understand how challenging it is, not just in the cities that we've already built in the north, but the cities in the global south that are growing at an astonishing rate, just to get basic things done, to actually be able to understand what citizens need, what businesses need, to understand what both of them can supply in terms of solutions, in terms of technology, and then how to mitigate all the unintended consequences of deploying these technologies in cities. And I have a lot of respect for what these people are doing. They're sort of the unsung heroes of my book. But as they move into the vanguard and I think are starting to take the mantle of thinking and doing and building smart cities, I worry because we know, I think, what industry has to offer. It has efficiency, has security, has convenience. That's the sort of value proposition of what big technology companies are offering. But what's coming up from the grassroots and from citizens themselves in terms of smart city technology is really kind of confusing. There's no coherent identity or direction to it. It's open data. I have multiple panels here about open data. Apps, right? I mean, if anybody look at your phone, you've probably got 3 or 4 apps that you only use in a particular city or a particular neighborhood or a particular place. There's DIY sensor networks that are being powered by open source hardware like Arduino. And then there's crowdsourcing, which is just a phenomenal technique for collecting data about the city, creating new insights. And again, it's these millions of inventors tinkering away in these 500,000 civic laboratories around the world. And a lot of what they're after isn't efficiency, it's sociability. They want to have new experiences. They want to expand the range of human experience. It's about transparency, about taking the workings of government and bringing it out into the open. And a lot of it's about fun. It's about gaming and entertainment. And so I've been struggling for frameworks to really understand what this means and where it's going. And I went back in time looking for guides. And in 1970 Silicon Valley, this is even before the Homebrew Computer Club, which is where Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak famously demoed the first Apple computer. This is a group that formed a couple of years before that called the People's Computer Company. And only in California do you get something like this. I mean, look at this diagram. It's like a clipper ship sailing off into the sunset with rainbows and psychedelic sunbeams coming out of it. This is a group called the People's Computer Company. And what they were excited about, they were a bunch of computer hobbyists, and they were excited about the potential of personal computing to decentralize computing power. Because up until then, it was only big institutions that could afford big mainframe computers. And the headline on this is the front page of their first newsletter, really, I think, summarizes where this grassroots smart cities movement is right now. And they wrote, computers are mostly used against people instead of for people, used to control people instead of free them. Time to change all of that. We need a People's Computer Company. In a lot of ways, I could see the inhabitants of the favelas looking at this control panel that's been installed in Rio and sort of thinking the same thing. Around the same time, you have media artists like Red Burns, who was a pioneer. She was a documentary filmmaker from Canada who came to New York. She was a pioneer in two-way cable television, set up an experimental network in Reading, Pennsylvania that was actually used by citizens to create video chat rooms. This is 40 years before YouTube. She went on to found the Interactive Telecommunications Program at New York University, which is a very influential media arts technology program, which she wrote in 1981. I think it sums up where we're at now as well. This is an era of technological promise. Not surprisingly, those most invested in exploring the new technologies come from the private sector. The focus of their interest is obvious: cost effectiveness. However, in concentrating on the bottom line, they have neglected the process through which people harness the technology to create a system. That creative process, although difficult to isolate or quantify, is a crucial element in the achievement of that promise. And this is almost like a Jane Jacobs way of thinking about the smart city. It's a smart city that's organic, that's going to bubble up from communities as they explore the possibilities. And so I was sort of satisfied that I'd figured out the technological side of this, and I started digging back on the urban side to try to find out, how did urbanists deal with previous waves of technological change? And in 1890s Victorian Britain, I found this rather odd-looking man, who some of you will know as Patrick Geddes. Patrick Geddes was a scientist based in Edinburgh. He was really just a remarkable figure among this community of British intellectuals who were trying to grapple with the problems that the industrial city was creating: overcrowding, health, pollution. And he, unlike the others, who were mostly architects and civil engineers, was an evolutionary biologist, and he was a very avid gardener. And he brought that biologist sensibility to city planning. And I think he has one of the richest perspectives on cities, even today. And he pioneered the idea that a city was sort of an organic structure that evolved in a very close relationship with its region. And that the city wasn't a machine, as many others were saying. It was actually an organism, it was alive. A city is not a place in space, he told a group gathered at the University of London in 1904. It is a drama in time. I find that just a really elegant way of thinking about cities. And so being a biologist led him down a really different road than his contemporaries, people like Ebenezer Howard, who proposed basically giving up on the industrial city and building new ones. And much the way we use these technology metaphors like smart and intelligent, digital and wired today, Howard used the technology, the cutting edge technology of the day, to describe his city and what he called the garden city. And his thinking was that the countryside and the city were both kind of like magnets, and they attracted and repelled people for different reasons. And the garden city would be a third kind of magnet that combined the best aspects of both the city and the countryside. And you have to think about the times, right? Electric street lighting had only been introduced like 10 years before in the London suburbs. And the idea of a city powered by electricity instead of coal, and a clean, efficient, modern, automated city was sort of very similar to the kinds of cities, smart city visions that are out there today, like New Songdo and Masdar in Abu Dhabi, which Dan talked about yesterday. Others propose not just building new cities, but actually blowing away the old city. And Patrick Geddes actually abhorred slum clearances. And soon after he married, in the 1870s, he had moved into downtown Edinburgh and moved his family into a tenement block, began buying up property, and began a process of what he called conservative surgery. Very careful, targeted, small-scale renovation of the city. And he sort of held that approach for his entire life. And I think it's a really instructive one as we think about building smart cities, that we shouldn't be thinking about building new, in the fields. We shouldn't be thinking about blowing away what we have. We should be thinking about a kind of soft transformation. The other interesting thing about Geddes that I've found is that he really believed in crowdsourcing. And he actually believed more in crowdsourcing than we do, because for him, participation in rebuilding cities and solving urban problems, it wasn't voluntary, it was compulsory. He believed that it wouldn't work if every single citizen wasn't mobilized in the effort. But he also believed that people had forgotten the history of the city. They didn't understand its problems. So he built this in Edinburgh and proposed building them all around the world. Civic immersion centers, what he called the Outlook Tower. And the Outlook Tower was basically a school, and people would be brought in there, they'd be brought to the roof, and they'd see the region through a camera obscura, and then they'd come down through the floors and see the city in ever greater and greater contexts. In case of Edinburgh, in Scotland, in Great Britain, and then Europe, and then the entire world. And then they would be thrust out the door onto the actual city street, where they had to confront it sort of face to face. And what he was teaching them was basically how to take social science, which was a very new thing, scientific study of society, and apply it to the problem of cities. And he called this field civics. And as I discovered this work, I started to wonder, what would a civics for smart cities look like? What if we stopped talking about the technology and instead started talking about a scientific application of what we're learning about cities to reshape them? if you go to, in the United States, civics has a somewhat different connotation, and it refers more to participation in community affairs. And one of the troubling trends right now is that I think the sort of ease of simply clicking on something like an app to report a pothole feels like civic participation. And I think it's good that we're expanding and making it easier for people to participate, but for Getty, civics meant a lot more than that. It meant really drawing on everything that we know, engaging everybody, and using just plain common sense to mobilize the citizenry to address the problems of the city. And so this is sort of where my book ended up. I was kind of inspired by Getty's, inspired by how he saw the role of the citizens in responding to rapid technological change. And I distilled basically 13 tenets of a new civics for smart cities that I think they're basically my proposal for a set of guidelines to just have in your head as you evaluate technological solutions to urban problems going forward. So the first, and here we go with the animation, is to opt into smart. I think it's easy to get seduced by quick technological fixes, and we've gone through a couple of years now where I think a lot of our mayors and city leaders actually have been seduced by these marketing pitches. I think they're starting to question those promises. And if anybody has read Evgeny Morozov's new book, Click Here to Save Everything, I think you'll share my conviction that the internet is not the answer to every problem. Actually, most urban problems have been solved already. It's just applying those solutions and scaling them and paying for them. And a lot of these tools actually create more problems than they solve. I mean, look at the automobile. The unintended consequences of motorization far outweigh the intended ones. And we're going to be undoing that for quite a long time. But I don't think we should be Luddites. We shouldn't just shun these technologies. And the way I think of this is you should future-proof your city so that you have the ability to install things down the road. If you tear up the streets to fix the water pipes, put in conduit for fiber optics or whatever's going to come after it. If you replace the street lamps, provide a place to mount a wireless node or whatever technology is going to come after that. If you generate a new set of data, document it and share it and maintain it so that it can be used by future generations. Second is what I call rolling your own network. I got my start in smart cities 12 years ago in the community wireless movement by working to light up a whole bunch of parks in New York City with free Wi-Fi. And we did that with no money at all. It was all donated hardware, donated bandwidth from libraries, volunteer labor, and a number of property organizations that saw this as something that would add value to their property. The situation is different in every country about cities getting into the broadband business. I think the US and the UK probably are a little bit behind the continent and other countries. I went to Moldova in August 2010, which is the poorest country in Europe. You probably don't even know where it is. It's between Romania and Ukraine, kind of a leftover remnant of the Soviet Union. Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, had faster, cheaper broadband in 2010 than Silicon Valley or New York City. And it's because they made some very smart investments in a neutral network that let lots of competition flourish. Other countries, you see people fighting telecom industry lobbyists who don't want government to introduce competition. The picture on the right here, I think another reason for rolling your own network is that we've come to depend on wireless networks that are very fragile. They're kind of oversubscribed. Hurricane Sandy in New York, where I live, which struck last fall, knocked out about 3,000 cell sites. And most of the region lost wireless coverage for a couple of days. This is when we needed it most, when the massive response of hundreds of agencies and tens of thousands of citizen volunteers relied upon this public switched wireless network to interoperate, and it failed us, mostly because they didn't have big enough batteries. That's a totally solvable problem. But what you saw were a bunch of wireless networks that had been deployed by communities. This is an experimental project in Red Hook in Brooklyn, a community mesh network and a public housing project that was able to stay up and provide vital communications for the neighborhood. And so by building their own broadband, this community was able to kind of prioritize a different set of values. And now there's talk about scaling that up in all the regions that are affected by flooding in New York City. The third tenet of this new civics for smart cities is what I call building a web, not an operating system. And everywhere you look, some company, some entity, some academic research group is trying to become the Microsoft of smart cities, though oddly enough, Microsoft itself has not yet made its play in this space. And the most nefarious is a Portugal-based group called Living Planet, which has recently relocated itself to London after this project fell apart. But they actually tried to trademark the term urban operating system. And the way they talk about it is kind of scary. One executive at a conference said, "This will control everything that happens in the city." I don't think anybody wants that. Anywhere in the world, I don't think anybody wants a piece of software that can do that. On the other hand, in the name of expediency of actually addressing global warming and all these big pressing urban problems, standards are really important. Jen Palka, who's the head of Code for America, this NGO in the US that sort of swaps technology between cities, I interviewed her for my book, and she said standards are important so that cities can collaborate with each other without having to talk about it. They can do things that benefit each other without all the meetings. The other thing about standards is that I think the web has standards. They're just different kinds of standards. They're open, they're voluntary, they're free, they're ad hoc, they're loosely coupled. So I think it's a better model, again, than the mainframe. I call this fourth one extended public ownership. And this is a picture of Daniel Sarasa, who's manager of Zaragoza, Spain's smart city project called the Digital Mile, or the Mila Digital. Spain is Spain's fifth largest city. And what he's holding up this is not a very smart technology. It's just an RFID card. It's a citizen card that the city started issuing last year. And this is your passport to the city. It lets you check a book out of a library, gets you onto the hundreds of free public Wi-Fi spots. You can pay for transit. You can unlock the bike share. It now allows you to get discounts or participating merchants. And what's interesting is that it's generating a lot of data about citizens and how they use the city. And I was so astounded by his perspective on this, because in the United States, if you had a system that was generating this much data, that would be seen as a huge liability. You'd want to outsource that, offload that. You wouldn't want to have to take care of that. And his perspective instead was that this is a really important role for city to play as a steward, as an intermediary of that very sensitive private data between citizens and the marketplace. Okay, they're socialists, but I think that's a very different view of city and government's role in this data marketplace that I think has a lot of legs going forward. So I think the idea of extending public ownership over the data that smart cities generate is an important one. There's a lot of talk about open data. Honestly, I don't even care about open data anymore. To me, it's just a matter of diffusion right now. Yeah, it's a great idea. Let's just do the work and get it done. What I'm worried about are the decision support tools, the algorithms and the software that operate on that data to advise city managers and city planners on the decisions that they make. And I think this is the next big frontier in terms of surfacing the logic behind smart cities. This is a picture of IBM's system dynamic model for Portland that was deployed by IBM in 2010 to help Portland's planners develop their 20-year plan, their 20-year sustainability plan. And what's interesting about it is that it allowed all of those assumptions to be brought to the surface. So, how does increasing spending on kindergarten lunches affect child health? Well, they built a model that simulates that, but you can go in and scrutinize the relationship and what they think, how they think one thing influences another. And that's really, really important. Most of the tools that cities use to make decisions don't have this level of transparency. I think we're already moving in the wrong direction too. New York City recently passed what I think is probably the most progressive open data law in the United States, if not the world. Basically requires that by 2018, every data set that can safely be made public is public. But there's a line in that law that says that computer code is exempt from disclosure requirements. And they did that because I think their vendors, possibly rightly so, wanted to be protected from having their valuable IP a piece of software that IBM or Microsoft had sold to the city or licensed to the city, getting out into the public domain. But it also means all of these tools that are used to make maps or to look at 311 telephone hotline data and say, hey, there's an increase in noise complaints in this part of the city. Let's reallocate enforcement resources there. The equation that triggers those things to happen, they're hidden. They may never see the light of day, and we need to understand the assumptions that are embedded in them. Next one is what I call graceful failure. This is a picture of Shibuya Crossing in Tokyo after the Fukushima meltdown and tsunami. And this is a smart city that doesn't have any electricity. Electricity is more important, I think, than the internet in powering the smart city because everything rides on top of it. Colin Harrison from IBM, who I mentioned earlier, said to me when I interviewed him that society rides on a number of tigers, and the electricity grid is one. And we need to seriously think about making sure that these things work. Another thing that I discovered, which shocked me during the research for this book, is that in most countries, the power grid is actually more reliable than the public cloud computing systems that we've come to rely on. So even in the northeast of the United States, which is the least reliable grid probably in the industrial world, it's still more reliable than Amazon's elastic compute cloud. It's more reliable than some of Google's cloud services. So we need to think about graceful failure at several different levels. Next is what I call build locally, trade globally. Again, this is what we're going to be talking a lot about in this panel this afternoon. Every city is unique, and that's a huge driver of innovation, but there's really an urgency to address these problems and to share solutions. And there's a number of organizations. I mentioned Code for America. CityMart, which is based in Barcelona, is another one. Some of the big international climate change groups like C40 are starting to get into this space and basically accelerate the flow of technological innovations between cities. If you look at something like bus rapid transit, that took 30 years to diffuse from Curitiba in Brazil, where it was developed, to cities all over the world. It took 5 years for bike sharing to spread rapidly after its first really large-scale deployment in Paris. These kinds of smart city solutions spread literally overnight. I mean, you can literally copy a piece of code from one city to another in a matter of seconds. But I think the key thing to think about here is, what do you tailor at home using local resources and local ideas, and what do you import from another city and simply install in your own? You'll recognize some of these people. They either spoke at this conference or they've been here in Manchester before. I think these are a handful of people who are able to simultaneously operate in the world of urbanism and the world of information technology. And they're a pretty rare breed. They're rarer than they should be at this point, given how important this is. And Red Burns, the woman who, the cable activist who founded the interactive telecommunications program at NYU that I talked about, the way she described their educational mission in the early 80s was really interesting. She said, we're training a new kind of professional, one who's comfortable with both analytical and creative thinking. And so I think there's a need to cross-train people, not just in cities and informatics, but people who can be scientists and artists at the same time. People who can appreciate, as Patrick Geddes did, that you need to have both a scientific and a understanding of science and of culture in order to really grasp rapidly changing cities. And so I think not just training more people like this, but creating institutions that can produce them is really important. And this is my favorite of all of these new civics principles. What you're looking at is a site that was built in Boston using open transit data, real-time train arrivals on the Boston the Boston Metro. And I think it's kind of like an ambient indicator of how well that train system is performing at any given moment. It's very bad. It's not so bad. And this is based on real-time data. But what fascinates me about it is that it draws attention to a very long-term planning issue, which is a chronic underinvestment in transit infrastructure, rolling stock, and transportation in general. And so it triggers me to think, real-time data is great for city management, for day-to-day operations, but what can it tell us? How can it inform long-term planning? There's another project that IBM did in Istanbul recently where they took the last month's worth of mobile phone call records from Vodafone. This is 1 billion records, entire city of Istanbul, and basically showed where people were when they placed calls. And they used that data to replan the entire bus system based on where people were actually going, rather than where the bus stops were. And that to me is fascinating because a month from now they can go and they can evaluate, did that work? Should we fine tune it a little bit? There's technologies, there's a firm based somewhere in southern England, I can't remember where, that has a technology called path intelligence that lets mall operators track pedestrians as they move through a shopping mall. And they can use that to maybe rearrange the location of stores or charge higher rent based on foot traffic. You can imagine a tool like that being used to plan a pedestrian plaza and to change it week to week based on changing patterns of use. And I think that's really, really important. The other thing about these kind of real-time data is that they create awareness of these long-term problems that allows citizens to start to initiate the planning process rather than just reacting. So you can imagine a dashboard in a neighborhood that's pulling building permit data or land transactions from a city database, and it's basically a gentrification indicator. Is someone amassing land? Are families being displaced in this neighborhood? How are schools performing? How's the crime rate doing? And increasingly you see cities putting these kinds of dashboards up, and I think it's fascinating. Everybody's excited about crowdsourcing, but this is really tricky because there's a fine line between crowdsourcing and privatization, as I'm sure you're all confronting in this country head on. This is a pamphlet published by the Regional Plan Association in New York in the 1930s, and was sort of trying to educate people about overcrowding. And I think it's really funny because they had this page which shows a parade, a church, a marketplace, and says, some crowds are good. And then you flip the page over, and it's an overcrowded subway platform or a riot, and some crowds are bad. And I think we need to keep that in mind as we think about crowdsourcing, because there are bad crowds out there. We're getting near the end here. This goes without saying. Where all this started out was thinking about inclusion, and connecting everybody is not just necessary for success, if you believe what Getty's thought. It's also the right thing to do. It's the fair thing to do. It's the equitable thing to do. But even the most basic smart city services that are out there, these government telephone hotlines, we use 311 in North America, have built-in exclusions in them. In every city that I've looked at, in English-speaking countries, in Vancouver, in San Francisco, in New York, in Boston, they're disproportionately used by native English speakers. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But again, as Stephen Johnson, the author, wrote this great article, which ended up in his recent book, Future Perfect, about how New York City is now using this massive big data of 311 reports to allocate city resources, hotspots of noise, of crime, of failed trash pickups, missed trash pickups. And so if this sensory data becomes a tool for allocating government resources to the people who complain the most, and the people that complain the most are the most empowered technologically and socially, then you're creating a system that's going to embed that discrimination going forward. In a sense, 311 is almost an invisible engine for reinforcing inequality. This is a bit of a tangent, but there's been a lot of talk recently about this man in particular, and about the influx of physicists and statisticians and computer scientists, sort of hard sciences as opposed to the soft sciences like sociology, into urban studies. And most of it's based on this growing abundance of big data about cities. And Jeffrey West is the man in the picture here. He's a physicist at the Santa Fe Institute. New York Times proclaimed a couple of years ago in a headline that he had solved the city because he discovered that there's this kind of elegant beauty in the way that cities scale. And what he found was that if you double the population of a city, you don't just get twice as much of everything, you get twice as much plus 15%. So people make twice as much money and 15% more. there's twice as much crime and 15% more. And it's sort of, I think of it as like a divine gratuity. It's the sort of reward that cities get from growing big. And it explains why cities keep growing, because there's increasing returns to scale. They become more innovative. They produce problems, but they produce solutions and wealth faster than they produce that. This has gained a lot of traction. He just got $750,000 for a book advance. I didn't get nearly that much. You can lop a couple zeros off. But his own colleagues and scholars like Michael Batty here at University College London, who is one of the, I think, leading people in the computer simulation of cities, have found massive holes in this, and that, in fact, it doesn't actually apply, for instance, here in the UK, where policy has both constrained cities from growing in certain places and decentralized and pushed growth into places where it might not naturally have gone. And this universal scaling is not actually a universal law of the city. Actually, the only thing that's universal about it is how pliant it is to our own interventions. So if we choose to scale cities in a different way, we actually have the tools to do that. And that, to me, is pretty fascinating. So this whole scientific sort of renaissance around urban studies, I think, is great because these people are very talented. There's 3 major university programs in applied urban science spinning up in New York City right now. There's one in Chicago. I think there's a couple in London as well. Zurich has a group that's trying to model the entire world, having successfully done so for the transportation system in Switzerland. I think we just need to be careful about this because one of West's biggest critics actually showed that the 100-year-old central place theory of economic geography explained all this data better than West's sophisticated model. And so we already knew this, and we knew how to explain this. Still, I think that these cities will be great laboratories for us to understand cities better. So the last thing I want to say, this is kind of a half-baked idea. My friend Andrew Blum, who wrote a really interesting book about the physical geography of the internet, has been talking about this idea of sort of user-created networks. He calls it the artisanal internet. So in order to match that, I came up with the hipster idea of slow data. This is sort of my counterpoint to big data. And what I mean by that is, rather than focusing on how we can harvest insights out of all of this data exhaust that comes out of business activity and us moving around with our mobile phones and all the things that we click on, maybe we should be thinking about taking things like Arduino and cheap technologies and instrumenting the things that we really care about. There was a group of students at NYU that stuck a moisture sensor in their plant in the lab and then hooked it up to Twitter so the plant could tweet them when it needed water. And they created a caregiving community for this plant with a single sensor and a couple bytes of data an hour. And I think that's really important, the idea that we should be instrumenting very socially significant phenomena and then pushing that into places that will actually change people's behavior rather than automate solutions to those systems. And this is a lost and found app that a guy I know in New York developed. And you could think of what Google or IBM's solution to lost and found would be in the smart city. It would be to tag everything, track everything, and put a search appliance on top of it. So I could just type in where are my keys, and it would pop up on a map. What this does is it incentivizes a community of finders to monitor requests for lost object retrieval, find it, and then meet face-to-face with the person who lost it to return it to them and have that wonderful social experience when you return a lost item to a stranger. It's kind of wishful thinking, but I think it really speaks to our humanity and the kind of smart cities we want to live in. So sort of where we wrap up, I think I think these civics really take inspiration from both an understanding of technology and this long appreciation of appreciation of the long history of people who have tried to engage citizens in solutions to city. And just to wrap up with Patrick Geddes again, Lewis Mumford, who was Geddes' most influential American disciple, sort of summed up, I think, the approach that Geddes took, and I think that we would be wise to adopt as we think about smart cities. And what he wrote, He wrote, "What Getty's outlook and method contribute to the planning of today are precisely the elements that the administrator and bureaucrat in the interest of economy or efficiency are tempted to leave out. Time, patience, loving care of detail, a watchful interrelation of past and future, an insistence upon the human scale and the human purpose above all merely mechanical requirements, and finally a willingness to leave the essential part of the process to those who are most intimately connected with it, the ultimate consumers or citizens." And so I think this is really what people all over the world are trying to do. They're trying to participate in weaving these technologies into our cities. And this is just an example of the Summer of Smart, which was held last year in San Francisco. It's happening again right now in London as a program called Urban Prototyping at Imperial College. And I think, if we strive for this, as we build the cities of the future, we'll make better choices about technology and we'll all be better off for it. So thank you very much.